Good afternoon, everybody. It's 12 o'clock and it's Thursday, and this means the fourth in the series of 5 carbon-based webinars from the AHDB. This afternoon's slot is measurement and management, and we have David Powlson, Angus Gowthorpe and Will Armitage, and myself, Harry Henderson, presenting to you. We will have some slides from David and introductions to the businesses from Angus and Will, and then ending this, we'll have a bit of a panel discussion. So it is all about asking questions. It is very much for you guys to put your questions in. We've already had a question in already, so it'll be surely be a good kickoff. We intend to run for an hour, but based on the questions that we've had in the last few webinars, this could overreach, but we'll bring it to a close at 10 to quarter past, something like that, if we need to overrun. Just a little bit of housekeeping. You'll be able to see us and hear us. We can't hear or see you. If you want to make contact with us, there's the question box that you can ask a question in, as you can see there. We'll keep the time, and the recording is happening. So usually within about a 24-hour time span, you'll be able to see the recording if you want to go over something again. And this is the same for all of the webinars that we've been hosting this week. You can see on Twitter, we've got all of our Twitter handles there: cereals, dairy, beef and lamb, and pork and horticulture. So if you want to tweet any of us, that's absolutely fine. So without any further ado, let's go on to the next slide, please. We've got David Powlson from Rothamsted, and spent a career in soil science and carbon measurement, and will take us through what his thoughts are in terms of measuring carbon. Over to you, David.
Right, well, thank you, and hello everybody, and thanks for the invitation to be here. Emily, go to the next slide, please. This is my little very simple diagram about the ins and outs of soil carbon. And organic matter in soil is approximately 50% carbon, so it's dominated by that. So as you can see on the left, the inputs of organic matter or carbon to soils, well, if you're growing crops, will always be roots, root exudates and stubble. There may or may not be above ground residues, depending how they're managed, and there may or may not be manures or other organic materials of that sort. Now, the fauna and the microbes in the soil will process these inputs. They will derive energy from them for their own functioning and growth. And we know that in temperate climates, within the first year, about 2/3 of the carbon coming in comes off as CO2, as the microbes have obtained energy and then release the CO2. So the third that remains behind is then further processed in future times, and some of that gets built in to more stable forms of soil organic matter. Next slide, please. Now, as you'll know, the properties of a soil are primarily determined by the texture. Is it clay? Is it sandy? The type of minerals, pH, climate, and so on. But these properties can be greatly modified by soil organic matter, which affecting things like the stability of aggregates, the pores, which influence the water relations in the soil, how easy or difficult it is for roots to penetrate, and all the other things listed on the right there. Next slide. I've borrowed a nice phrase that I picked up a couple of weeks ago from a colleague at the University of Reading, Dr. Tom Sisma. When he was talking about soil organic matter, he said, not all soil organic matter is created equal. And I thought it was just rather nice. So the top line there, you can see that there's a spectrum. Some of the organic matter, carbon in soil, is extremely stable. And if we're trying to sequester carbon, that's what we're interested in. On the other hand, at the other end, some is very unstable, very fast turnover. So root exudates will be in that category, and those are very important for microbial activity. So it's not one or other types that we want. We need all of them. Moving down to the next blue line. This is talking about the stabilization of organic matter in soil through association with minerals and other, with minerals in soil. So again, on the left, some organic matter is strongly bound to the surface of clays or to iron and aluminium oxides. This is probably the most stable carbon in soil, but some is free. Could be a bit of root that came in yesterday, and then there's other ones in between. And then also there's a lot of interest in what people often call active fractions within total soil organic matter. One of these is the quantity of carbon held in the cells of living organisms, what we call microbial biomass, something I've looked at quite a lot over my career. And this often is about between 2 and 4% of the total carbon in soil, a small fraction, but very important. And there are other ways of examining fractions that we think are active. Next slide, please. Right, when we think about organic matter in soil, which, as I said, is about 50% carbon, we can look at it through two different lenses, if you like. One is what I call the soil health or soil quality lens that affects how the soil functions and then has an impact on growth of crops. The other lens is the global carbon cycle lens, which is to do with climate change, making climate change either better or worse. And this arises because, as you can see, the quantity of carbon held in the world's soils to a depth of 1 meter is estimated to be about twice the quantity of carbon in the CO2 in the atmosphere. So it's a big stock that actually matters. If we can put more carbon into that stock, taking it from the atmosphere, that will slow climate change. On the other hand, if we release some of that, it's by deforestation, for example, it makes things worse. The other thing to note is that agriculture can be a source of two other important greenhouse gases, particularly nitrous oxide, but also methane, which are very powerful greenhouse gases. So it's not totally a carbon story. Next slide, please. Right, now for soil health, soil functioning, it's the flow of carbon through the soil that matters. This is what gives energy to the microbes to do their work. And there's evidence that even a small change in the carbon concentration in the soil can have a big effect on soil functioning, particularly on soil physical properties. But for climate change mitigation, it's different. It's the absolute quantity of carbon that counts. How many gigatons can we lock up, or do we risk releasing? And to do that, to estimate that, you need to have a measure of the soil bulk density, which is often not done and quite tricky to get an accurate value of. Next one, please. I'm going to just say something about crop yields, and I'm going to refer to two of the very long-term experiments we have at Rothamsted. On the left, the broadbalk experiment that's grown winter wheat since 1843, and on the right, the Nuffield experiment where spring barley has been grown for almost as long. And the data I'm going to show is all freely available on this, what we call ERA, Electronic Rothamsted Archive website. So here's the, some yields, some selected treatments of the broadbalk winter wheat experiment. Look over to the right, you'll see some a red sort of oval. This shows you the lower one, the yields of winter wheat in the treatments getting either inorganic fertilizers, NPK, and others, or manure. And surprisingly, and over the whole period of the experiment, both of these treatments given about the same crop yield. Further up, we've got yields of wheat in a first wheat in a rotation, first wheat after a break crop. This was introduced in the 1960s. And again, much bigger yields, but again, the same conclusion that the inorganic fertilizer and the manure treatment give about the same yields, which again is really quite surprising. Next slide, please. It's surprising because when manure has been applied at a very high rate every year, of course, soil organic carbon is increased. You can see by the upper curve here.
David, and just if I can interject, could you just go a little bit slower through the slides?
Yep,
We've had a question to just
yep, okay.
Take your time a little bit.
Sorry.
Okay, yep. Great, thanks.
Right, so here we have soil carbon measured in archived samples, soil stored from the experiment, and we can see that the carbon where manure has been applied has gone up a lot. It's now about 2.5 times that in the inorganic fertilizer treatment, and the physical structure of that soil is far better. Just as a little aside, I'll comment that the carbon in the NPK treatment is a little bit higher than in the unmanured treatment. This is because there are bigger inputs from roots and stubble and exudates, and even that little increase has a measurable effect on soil physical properties. Okay, the next slide, please. Right, now again, this is a bit complicated looking, but look over to the right there. This is the yields on the spring barley experiment. We've got a different story. We cannot match the yield that you can get on the high organic matter manure treatment with only inorganic fertilizers here. There's a yield gap of at least 2.5 tons per hectare between the best we can do with no manure and what we can get with manure. So next slide, please. So we've got two different situations. Winter wheat, the yield seems to be insensitive to organic matter content of soil. With spring barley, it's quite the opposite. We can only get the highest yield where we've increased soil organic matter content through the manure treatments. And I think the reason probably is that spring barley, like many other crops, has a short growing season, so it hasn't got time to overcome a poor start. Whereas with winter wheat, it's got a lot of time. It can overcome poor early growth, and we do see poorer early growth where we've got low organic matter content. Okay, next slide, please. Right. Those results are actually quite consistent with a review of experiments across Europe led by colleagues from Wageningen University, where they asked a very specific question in the box on the bottom left there. They said, is there a unique effect on crop yield of adding manure in addition to the nutrient supply? Because of course, if you add manures, you build up organic matter. These are giving you nutrients, so you're not needing to supply nearly as much inorganic fertilizers. Next slide. The answer to their question was, well, they said the effect was surprisingly small, but consistent with what we found. Look on the left in the middle panel, there is this unique effect where you've got spring sown crops. You can see that with sugar beet, potatoes and maize, and with the cereals at the bottom left, you get this unique effect with the spring sown cereals, but not the autumn sown ones. Next slide, please. Right, now in terms of soil quality, if you like, soil functioning, soil properties, the good news is that a little bit of organic carbon goes a long way. There's a big effect on soil physical and biological properties. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of that. Next slide. This is a review I did 10 years ago now of a straw incorporation or removal. This was done at a time when there was interest in removing straw and burning it in power stations to produce energy. Many of us soil scientists said, well, hang on a minute, straw is not a waste product, it's a resource. So we reviewed some data from 25 experiments where straw was either been removed or returned. Next slide, please. The results of this review were partly surprising and partly not surprising. First of all, in terms of total soil organic carbon, where straw was retained, there was a trend for soil carbon to increase, exactly as you'd expect. But that trend was pretty small. It was only statistically significant in about a quarter of the experiments. I think this is probably because the largest amount of carbon enters the soil through the roots, the stubble and the exudates. In some of the experiments, the scientists had also measured some biological properties, some of these active fractions within the total, either microbial biomass or something else. And there they found there were quite big changes in these, even where total carbon had not changed much. And then in some of the experiments, soil physicists had measured sort of physical properties like aggregate stability or penetrometer resistance, and there were examples of these being improved even where there was no measurable change in total soil carbon from returning the straw. Okay, the next slide. Right, this is some work led by my colleague Chris Watts. It was done quite a long time ago. You'll see a picture of a straw there. That'll be anathema to many people. This is not a recommendation to plough, but this is a machine they had for measuring what you might call workability, or the draft force, how difficult it is to pull an implement through the soil. If they were doing it now, I think they'd do it based on a single tine rather than a plough, but that's what they had at the time. So next slide. So they pulled this gadget through the whole of our long-term broadbore experiment, had a map of this draft force. And the next slide just picks out a few of the, next slide. Yep, that picks out just a few of the data. So you can see the nil plot, no fertilizer, no manure, got very low organic carbon content. Manure has increased that carbon content about nearly 2.5 times. And this specific draft, the energy to pull the implement through the soil has come down. Whereas the inorganic fertilizer plot, its soil carbon content has only gone up a little bit compared to the nil, but the draft force has gone down almost as much. So this was quite interesting. A small change in carbon had a big effect. And my third example concerns a lay arable experiment. This is at Woburn, a Woburn farm. It's Cottenham series, sandy soil. So there are comparison of continuous arable cropping with arable interspersed with pasture, lays of different length. The next slide, please. My colleagues who did this work picked out one of the lay arable treatments. In this case, soil carbon had increased by 11%, a modest increase compared to the continuous arable, because you were growing either grass or a grass clover mixture every so many years. But if they looked at microbial biomass, one of these active fractions, soil carbon had gone up by 86%, very nearly doubled, so much more sensitive than total carbon. And this has impact on the biological processing and the physical properties of the soil. And on the right, this gross end mineralization is a sort of a measure, an indicator of the rate of nitrogen cycling within the soil, and that had increased much more as well. Okay, the next slide. Right, now the other aspect of looking at soil carbon, as well as improving soil structure and functioning, of course, is to think about, can we lock up carbon and slow climate change? And for that to happen, an absolutely essential thing is that carbon is transferred from CO2 in the atmosphere to the land, the soil. That's not happening. All we're doing is shuffling deck chairs, for example. We can't, if we're just redistributing carbon from one place to another, that's not slowing climate change. So an example of that would be manure. So of course, adding manure to soil is, as we've seen, is very good for the soil properties and so on, but it's not taking extra carbon from the atmosphere. If you've got animals, you've got the manure already. So you might choose to put it on one field or another. And of course, there are ways of using it more efficiently than others. But basically, it's moving carbon spatially from one place to another. Zero till is a bit of a mixture. A major effect of zero till is to concentrate soil carbon near the soil surface. There are plenty of benefits of doing that. But the big effect you measure on the surface isn't the full story, because there's a bit less carbon deeper down. But in the long term, if you continue zero tillage for a good number of years, I think you do actually tend to increase the total stock in the whole profile. You've got to remember, of course, that soil carbon reaches a maximum. It doesn't go on increasing forever. And you've got to be careful about that. First, it's a finite quantity, but also the rate of increase is fastest in those early years. So you've got to be careful when people quote rates of increase. High rates in the first 5 years or so won't continue forever. And of course, it's reversible if you do zero tillage, but then stop doing that. You lose the carbon you've built up. If you already start at a high level, there's little scope to increase. So the next click, please. So here is a list of practices that genuinely do, I think, sequester carbon, take it from the atmosphere to the soil. Some are easier to do than others. So cover crops is one. They're photosynthesizing where soil would otherwise be bare. And you'll hear more about this from other speakers in a few minutes. Retaining crop residues is also a way of bringing in carbon that's come from the atmosphere. As I said, having a rotation with pasture in it rather than only arable crops is beneficial. Of course, that's quite a big change if you're in your system. It could be zero till, yeah, partially is positive here. Increasing crop yields means that you're going to have a bigger amount of root and exudates and stubble going into the soil, but you've got to be careful about what you do to get those bigger yields. the greenhouse gas cost of those treatments, and nitrogen fertilizer has a particularly large greenhouse gas impact. Things like agroforestry and intercropping are also ways of getting more carbon into the soil than you would otherwise have. The biggest thing you can do is actually remove land from cropping. But of course, if you do that, you're not producing any food. And the key thing, important, is to avoid the opposite happening. There's still far too much globally deforestation and draining of peats and wetlands happening, and this is releasing carbon to the atmosphere. So, final slide, it is, please. Right, so concluding comments. So, increasing or often maintaining soil organic matter is always good for soil functioning. A small change can have a big positive effect. But it doesn't guarantee increased crop yields, but there are plenty of other benefits. And of course, one of those is that you're not having to give nearly as much inorganic fertilizer. So there's both financial and a greenhouse gas saving there. And you're giving greater, I think, resilience of the system to adverse weather. So it's a bit of a, you're guarding to some extent against climate change. Right, carbon sequestration to slow climate change. There are some genuine options, and they all have the multiple benefit of improving soil quality or health as well. There are all sorts of practical or economic barriers to some of these practices. Some can be tackled, some are more difficult. Be careful about people overselling climate benefits because they don't carry on forever, and the highest rates are in the early years and the amount is finite. But whatever we can do is obviously worth trying. And something I've not really talked about is improved nitrogen management. Now, as I think I hinted at, when you use nitrogen fertilizer, or indeed nitrogen from legumes or manures, particularly from fertilizer, you certainly get some nitrous oxide gas emitted to the atmosphere, and a little of that goes a long way. It's 300 times more powerful than CO2 as a greenhouse gas. So anything you can do to improve your nitrogen management is beneficial for climate change. So use decision support systems, perhaps do soil N-min measurements, perhaps use whatever types of precision nitrogen spatially variable applications you can. Inhibitors can be helpful, and all of these things. So I often say for carbon, think nitrogen. It's not purely, greenhouse gases are not purely a carbon story. So at that point, I will finish.
Thank you, David. Right, we've got a good number of people on board now, so we thought we'd have a little poll. So just again, your thinking, the audience's thinking, and to reveal this in a few seconds, are you not really thinking about carbon? Are you measuring soil carbon with an ambition to manage it? Are you actively measuring and managing soil and soil carbon in mind? Or are you considering a radical change on your plot of land, something like commercial timber? Commercial timber is something that is thought that you harvest the timber, you build buildings with it in the next 50 to 100 years time, and the carbon from those timber is stored, and then you replant some more timber. So that's the thinking behind there, rather than woodland. So we'll close the thing now. Close it. So there we are. 37% not really thinking about carbon, but we'll need to know about it. 33% measuring soil carbon with an ambition to measure it. 27% actively measuring and managing soil with soil carbon in mind, and just 4% thinking about something completely different. So interesting, really. Then we'll go on to the next slide. What is your main question around soil carbon? We're not promising on this occasion that we're going to answer all of these questions, but what is soil carbon? How do you measure it? Fairly straightforward and simple. What is the best way of improving soil carbon storage? What benefits do soil carbon bring to my farming system? And the old chestnut, will I get paid for storing carbon in the future? So vote away. Let's see, we'll give it a few more seconds. We can see what's building. Keep clicking if you haven't already. And we can see that's building nicely. A few more seconds. and we shall close it. And there you go. 20%, what is soil carbon, how to measure it. So I should think you're fairly confident with that. The highest at 40% is what is the best way of improving soil carbon storage. 18%, what can it bring to my farming system? And 22%, will I get paid for storing carbon in the future? And it's interesting. I'm sure it's interesting to you guys out there, and it's interesting to us to give us a steer on upcoming projects. Next then, we have Angus Gowthorpe. Angus farms just south of York, is an active benchmarker using the Farm Bench program for his cost of production, and with an ABG up there, and is involved in Base UK as well. So we've got a few slides from Angus and a run through of his business and how carbon affects him. So over to you, Angus.
Thank you, Harry. Good afternoon all. So as Harry said, we're farming just south of York in the Vale with a mixture of sand, medium loam, silt and clay soils, running a 7-year rotation at the moment with winter wheat, spring barley and winter barley, winter linseed, spring oats, spring beans and herbal lays within there where we can for the cattle. And if we can get a catch crop in between harvest of one crop and drilling the next crop in the autumn, we will do. So we're looking for a minimum of 5 to 6 weeks for that. And then we've got cover crops before the spring crops as well, and they're overwintered. Sometimes they're grazed by sheep over winter if ground conditions allow. We started out strip tilling, and we strip tilled for 2 years, and for the last 6 years we've been entirely no-till with a John Deere drill. 40 cow pedigree Slayer suckler herd, and in 2018 I was runner-up in the Farm Carbon Cutting Toolkit Solar Farm of the Year competition. Next slide, please. So just a brief image of the carbon cycle. So obviously, as we all know, photosynthesis is converting carbon dioxide into sugars in the plant, and with a lot of those sugars are transferred down into the plant roots, not just above ground, and a lot of that is exudated from the roots to feed the soil microbiology, which then in return feeds the plants by accessing nutrients that the plant roots alone cannot reach, and that then can become long-term carbon storage. Next slide, please. So the key points that I'd like to raise, really, 60% of carbon is taken in as carbon dioxide by the plants, building the roots and exudated by the roots, as I say, to feed the soil microbiology. For every 1 kilo of inorganic N applied that isn't taken up by a plant, significant amounts of carbon are burnt off. So we really need to concentrate on the management of inorganic nitrogen and maximise nitrogen use efficiency, and using organic nitrogen as much as possible, which is far kinder on the soil and the plant. Ploughing and heavy cultivation releases 2 to 5 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent per hectare. And if that heavy cultivation or ploughing is then overwintered, a further 3.5 to 5 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent is released. So you've got massive amounts of carbon dioxide released, which is losing carbon from the soil. In comparison, a direct drilled overwintered cover crop can gain 5 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent into the soil. So you've got a 10 tonne a hectare, oh sorry, 15 tonne a hectare difference potentially as a maximum. So know where you're starting from. Use a carbon calculator such as Cool Farm Toolkit or the Farm Carbon Cutting Toolkit to establish where you are and where you need to go. Thank you. Next one. Right, so the methods I'm using on farm to conserve and increase my soil carbon stocks: running a diverse rotation with crop types, spring crops and legumes in there as well, cover and catch crops, again with legumes in there, companion plants such as on that initial slide with berseem, clover and spring beans within the oilseed rape, We've got white clover running as an understory across increasing areas of the farm. Bicropping such as beans and oats, or oilseed rape and peas, commonly known as piola. That, again, I know that can be easier for those with livestock because they don't necessarily need to split, such as beans and oats or peas and barley, from each other. They can feed that as a whole ration. So that's a great opportunity there for those with livestock. Grass in the rotation, preferably herbal lays, so you're getting maximum amount of rooting and various rooting depths, and that gives you a great deal of resilience to different weather types that we seem to be experiencing more and more, particularly in the droughts. Those herbal lays just continue yielding consistently regardless of the weather patterns. So no soil disturbance through no-till establishment. Chopping the straw as much as possible, adding FYM and compost. Sewage cake, I'm not a great fan of it, but it is bringing organic matter back to the soil. If that's the only option, or you could look at a bed and breakfast pig unit. So you're getting, yes, you're taking a straw off, but you're putting that enhanced straw back as FYM. Increasing nitrogen use efficiency, reducing nitrogen applications. Personally, we've dropped our nitrogen applications by 1/3, and we're looking to decrease them again, by reducing our nitrogen applications. That allows us to use a lot more biology, and that therefore then allows us to reduce our synthetic fungicide and insecticide applications, using plant growth promoting bacteria in that microbiology that we're applying to the soil and the plants. Mob grazing the herbal lays and the permanent grasses. Looking after our trees and hedgerows, and establishing agroforestry systems or silver pasture for the livestock. Thank you.
Thank you, Angus. That's great. We've got plenty of questions coming in. We're certainly going to be busy in the questions front and the panel discussion. So, but if you do come up with a question, keep on plumbing them in. We'll get them asked. If we've run out of time for asking them, then we'll send them to the appropriate speaker and get them answered and reply to you individually. We have now got Will Armitage. He runs at Gowthorpe Farms, dairy herd across 3,000 acres, and many other enterprises as well. And so he's really our grass expert, if you like, and we can hear from Will about what he gets up to over there. Over to you, Will.
Great, thanks, Harry. You can hear me okay?
Very well, yeah, perfect.
Yeah, good stuff. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Good to be here. So I'm pretty much just an organic farmer. We'll go back a slide, actually, please, Emily. Yeah, that's it. So just that picture there with the cows. We're in Leicestershire, 520 feet above sea level. You're looking in a northeasterly direction there. The crops there, they're all grown organically. So there's grass and red clover, there's lucerne, fodder beet next to a cover crop, and then there's oats, red clover, and then down the bottom there's a really diverse whole crop that we're using. So we are about grass and cows, but we do have to actually grow lots of quality forages. And we find a mix is better than, diversity is far better than single stands. But just some of the yields, we can get up to sort of 12.5 tons of dry matter from our conserved forages. The oats in the middle there, that was actually a 3-ton crop of winter oats after a grass lay. Fodder beet, this year we were 28 tons, last year we were 30 tons per acre. And then the whole crop, we're growing that about 15 tons. This is per acre, 15 tons of fresh weight per acre in about 100 days. But we can talk about that a little later. Okay. So the actual business as it stands at the moment, Gowthorpe Lakes Farm is the main business. And on 730 acres of organic land converted in 2005. Glebe is a farm that I part own, and we've actually dropped cow numbers there to the 200 cows because we've just struggled to grow the amount of dry matter that we need in the last couple of years. And then I'm also in the Farm Right Partnerships. I was in the right place at the right time. So 1,700 acres of organic land came up. It's about 24 miles away from us, but it's still worth having. And then Manor Farm at Thrussington is actually a conventional unit. Okay. I think the starting point for any farm is knowing, what you've got. We can assess our soil types and see what they are, but actually doing the basic NPK system doesn't actually give us enough knowledge about our soils on farm. So I actually like, and it's got Glenside on the top, but it's basically an Albrecht soil analysis, and I like this because we know what our base saturation levels are and the quantities of all minerals, basically. And if you look at the pie chart down the bottom, that's actually our soil. So you can see we're very high calcium in our soils, a little bit low on mag. So any fertilizer policy we need to be thinking about, putting some magnesium in so that these plants actually photosynthesize to their maximum, and when they're photosynthesizing to their max, they will be exuding an awful lot of exudate and carbon into the soil. But that's basically our soils as they are now. So when we first came here back in 1990, our soil organic matters were sort of the 1s and the 2s. And since we've had cows on the farm, we actually started in 1990 and we converted to organic in 2005, but there's been a significant shift in the organic matter since we've been organic, and that's mainly, I think, due to more biological soil, more microbes in the soil, and not killing those soil biology with the nitrogen fertilizer that we had been doing. The other interesting fact is that our pH has stabilized at 6.9, so we never need to put any lime on. So I think our soil is it's in a pretty good state at the moment. But the big numbers really on here are the phosphorus and potash and how much we've actually got available to us in our soils. There's tons of P and K in our soils, and it's about mobilizing that and utilizing that going forward. Okay. So for me, I actually did a Nuffield Scholarship a few years ago, and I was really hung up on the soil food web and that we knew very little about the soil microbes. We know 1 to 2%, and there's supposedly more soil microbes in a handful of soil than there are people on the planet. And it wasn't really until I met up with Gary Zimmer in America, and he said, well, do you know all the microbes in your cows? And we had previously in another life been the highest yielding herd of cows in the country, and I need to know how to feed cows. And so he said, well, just feed the soil. It's a living organism and you've got to feed it. The best way of feeding that soil is with plant exudate. So at all times you've actually got to keep it green. But the interesting fact is when you look at the soil biology and their carbon nitrogen ratio, you can see by putting excessive amounts of artificial nitrogen on how you can actually kill off your soil biology, and so you can end up with a deader soil. And if you get a deader soil, you will struggle to grow highly mineralized plants and food. And the plants don't necessarily function to their best of the ability. Being organic, we can't use any nitrogen fertilizer, but I think there's probably an optimum level that could be used, far less than has been used in the past. So I think what we've got to do is think about the microbes and just be thinking about that soil biology all the time, because at the end of the day, it is a living organism that we're working with. Okay. So again, when I was on my Nuffield, I spoke to a chap in Australia, and he said he was actually growing an inch of topsoil a year, and I didn't believe him and didn't see how that was possible. But it's not growing it up on top, it's actually going down deeper through the profile. And what I've got there is a penetrometer, and so you push it into the soil, and it's just basically an implement that you use to assess the PSI. And at 300 PSI, a thread root can't actually penetrate it. So what we want is our soils to be deep and not hit that 300 PSI. So a wheat or a grass plant, as soon as it hits that 300 PSI, it can't actually penetrate. And when it can't penetrate, we actually get an anaerobic soil. So, you know, there is a risk of, you know, min-till and going that way. If you're not using plants that are going to put the roots down deep enough and actually break up those pans, you could actually be losing a bit of topsoil. And there's obviously some numbers there to calculate, you know, plough versus min-till and all the rest of it. But the most important thing is we get roots down into that zone to actually keep our topsoil there. And we have the potential here in the UK to actually grow our topsoils. If we grow our topsoils, we can actually capture far more carbon because we've got more soil to work with, both in the form of liquid carbon as microbes, but also more stable carbon as humus as well. The nitrogen bags flying around in the air there's actually 78,000 tons of nitrogen above every hectare on this planet, because all the air that we breathe in is 78% nitrogen. So there's a massive amount of nitrogen continually around our systems that we actually should be utilizing out of the air. And again, that's really important, because if we can get air pockets deeper into our soils, we can hopefully popularize that with nitrifying bacteria and actually use more N out of the air than people are pulling out of the ground as oil at this moment in time. Okay. Yeah, so plant diversity and the synergies, I think it will take agriculture to the next level, and progressive farmers out there are looking at bi-cropping and tri-cropping like Angus, and we've got to basically keep the soil green at all times. Just on our whole crops, so we grow a whole crop for our cows, which is a mix of oats, barley, peas, beans and vetch. So you've got the synergy there between the legumes and the cereals. And we'll also plant underneath that, underneath that we'll undersow grass and clovers, so Italian ryegrass and red clover, white clover. So it's a massive old mix, and by doing that, we actually keep that that field green for a long time. Okay. And at the end of the day, photosynthesis fuels all life on Earth. That's where all the carbon comes from. A good grass lay can capture as much carbon as the rainforest. Okay, we're about cycling the carbon. As farmers, we're cycling carbon, but we want to capture that carbon. And as David said, we actually get to a level where it plateaus, but at that point, I think our output is probably optimized on farm. So when we pan out with our carbon in our soils, that's probably the optimum production that we can produce with very low inputs. I think the other thing is when you have a healthy soil, you'll actually grow higher integrity feed, so there'll be less challenges in terms of disease pressures. And when you grow high integrity feed, then that moves into the cow health and human health as well. Okay, thanks.
Great, thanks, Will. That's a really great run through of what you do there. So we're on good time. We've got 15 minutes or more for discussion. We've got an awful lot of questions to go through, which is fantastic. If we don't get through them all, we'll send them off to the appropriate people and try and get back to you with an answer at least by the end of the week, if not sooner. So into the first questions really, and I think we haven't really let Will off the hooks just yet. First one is, we understand that 45% of grass dry matter is carbon, but how do farms utilize grass production, measure the amount of carbon inputted through photosynthesis? You got a thought on that, Will? How would you measure the amount of carbon?
Yeah, so
in grass?
yeah, 50% of the photosynthetic energy that is absorbed by the plant is probably exuded into the soil. You know, David would have a better idea of that. You know, I'm speaking from a point of what I've seen on farm, but certainly we need to be keeping it green all the time. And I don't know, David, do you think 50% of the exudate is a fair figure?
I really don't know. There were experiments done on this sort of thing, and some people have got figures of about 30%. But I think the principle is the more photosynthesis you've got going on, the more carbon will be going into the soil through whether it's through roots or exudates or bits of stubble or leaves that fall off. This is all good input.
I think one of the questions that needs to be answered is that a grass plant can potentially capture 4 times the amount of carbon compared to a wheat plant when you look at the leaf area index and its growth habit. And so as we go forward, in terms of carbon payments and things like that, where do we sit with grass versus wheat? And David was saying actually there's always a benefit of putting grass into a rotation to actually build that soil health.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding is, obviously I'm not a farmer, is that there's been this specialisation of farming during the course of my lifetime since the Second World War, really, for all sorts of reasons, by economics, really, I guess. There's no doubt that if you've got a mixed system with some pasture in it that's grazed by animals, your average soil carbon will be higher. And also it makes it easier to recycle the nutrients in the manure rather than having everything separated. So if policy, whether it's paying for carbon or just other policies, make a mixed system more viable and possible, then this is beneficial from just about every point of view, I guess.
Okay, great. Next question we've got is from a multiple vegetable grower. They're looking to estimate the amount of carbon sequestered by the soil during the crop growth and crop rotation. What would be the best method to do this? David, would you like to come in on that?
Total soil carbon changes slowly. That's in fact why the long-term experiments like ours and many others around the world are so valuable, because you can't measure a change in total soil carbon in 1 year or even a handful of years. You're really looking at absolute minimum usually of 5 years, probably more like 10, before a change in management will give you a measurable change in total soil carbon. But what you can do, I think, is measure fractions within that total, which give you a sort of an early warning and tell you the direction you're going in. Is it going up, staying constant, or going down? So things like the amount of carbon in the cells of microbes, what I call microbial biomass carbon, is one way of doing that. And it's not the absolute value, absolute number that matters, but it's either the trend, because it does, that will, fractions like that, and other ones will change quicker than total, or expressing those fractions as a percentage of the total. So I think there are methods that we can use like that that will tell you the trend, but to actually get, you know, the number of tons of extra carbon is quite difficult. The other way of approaching it is to say, look, we know quite a bit about how different management practices affect soil carbon. We've got computer models which are by no means perfect, but are not all that bad. So we would sort of know, you know, on a particular soil type in a particular climatic region. Let's say you changed from only arable to an arable pasture system. It would be possible to say, our models could say, well, over 10 years, your soil carbon is likely to change by this much. So that will be another way, I think, of assessing this rather than trying to measure this slow change. Yeah, so that's two approaches.
Okay, Angus, what's your experiences of soil measurement toolkits? Have you used one in particular?
The one I've used is the Farm Carbon Gutting Toolkit that Becky Wilson uses, and I do find it excellent because on a whole farm basis, it doesn't just include your what's happening in the field. It's looking at trees and hedgerows as well, and plastic use and fuel use, etc., etc. But for trying to raise your organic matter levels, your carbon levels in field, as David says, measurement it is very much a long-term thing, and it is a slow process. But the more practices you can carry out that we know improve soil health and improve organic matter, the better. So if you can get farmyard manure on, or organic manures applied to the land, you can reduce the depth of cultivation and the frequency of cultivation. If you can include a green leaf, whether it be cover crops, catch crops, or grass in that rotation as much as possible, try and keep a living root at all times, have diversity of species in there, and diversity of rooting depths, then you're ticking all the boxes to be, that should indicate that you would be raising your organic matter levels and your soil health.
Yep, great stuff. Okay, we'll move on. Will, do you want to come in?
Just quickly, I think one of the best ways of actually increasing soil carbon is mob stocking. We do it with dry cows, but that, you know, there are significant benefits of that. And when you look at the plains in America, they were all built with buffaloes mob stocking them. So if these arable guys are really serious about improving, you know, their soils, you know, mob stocking is a real option to them, I think.
Yeah, great stuff. Interesting question here. If, and I think if is the biggest word ever, if you can increase soil depth, can you go on sequestering soil carbon without reaching a plateau? Who would like to tackle that one? David?
I would say no. I think increasing soil depth, it's sort of true that, I mean, we know in our long-term experience, if you've got a system, if you change from arable to grass, let's say, or indeed arable to woodland, you're increasing soil carbon because you've got more inputs and you're not disturbing it. Actually, the surface level of the soil does go up, and we have to worry about that in terms of how we sample. But this is really because you're decreasing the density of the soil. The amount of mineral material stays the same. If like you're increasing the spaces between it, we know there's plenty of benefits for that. So I wouldn't quite express it as increasing amount of soil. But the extreme situation is where you do build up carbon, I'll say infinitely, but with very little limit, is where you've got very wet and cool conditions. That's where peat is produced. I mean, otherwise, I think in our you know, more normal conditions to that, I think you've always going to have a limit to how much carbon that you can reach in a soil.
Yeah. Okay, great. We'll move on. Plenty of questions coming in. Another if question. One for Angus maybe. If you have high residue at the soil surface, will it contribute to higher carbon oxidation, resulting in bigger losses to the environment as CO2?
There will be, in above ground plant biomass, largely, as I understand it, is cyclical, in that above ground biomass carbon basically returns back to the atmosphere. The more woody that material is, the slower that will happen. The more leafy, lush that material is, the quicker it will happen. I guess part of that question might be, should I incorporate it to slow down that release or prevent that release? Well, the thing is, if you incorporate it, you're then burning carbon off by moving the soil, you're destroying the mycorrhizal fungi network, and you're actually doing more harm than good.
Yeah, yeah.
David,
David,
there is a thing called the priming effect, and in experiments you can demonstrate this, that are set up to do it. If you add some organic substrate to a soil, particularly one that's very low in organic carbon, so the bugs are, if you like, short of energy, the microbes will start using the energy from what you've added. And the argument is that then, because they're now more active, or there's more of them, they will use up some of the organic matter that was already there. Now, that you can demonstrate that effect, but it's a small effect. As I say, it's sort of a thing which scientists get excited about, but I really don't think it's something to get worried about in terms of managing land in the real world.
great. Will, go on.
Yeah, no, I think we've got to move on from that in terms of, brown residue sitting on top of land. We've got to try and keep it green all the time, so it's maximising that photosynthesis all the time. So if that's wheat crops or cereal crops with clover undersown under them, as soon as that crop comes off, there's another crop there. And then destructing that and going again. So yes, I think there's obviously an advantage of brown carbon going into the soil, but we need to be keeping it green, keeping that soil breathing at all time. Yeah.
Yep. Great stuff. Okay, that's super. One for David. Back to David again. A small change equals a large effect. Can you quantify what a small change is, please? 1%, 2%, or less?
Oh gosh, well, I think it depends what measurement you're looking at, and I'll be pushed to do it off the top of my head. But I mean, yeah, I don't know. In some of our experiments, soil carbon might have changed by a few percent of what it, I don't mean if you're going, when I say a few percent, I don't mean going from 1% to 2% carbon, but going from 1% to 1.1%. That would be like a 10% change. That would be quite small, but that change could have got a measurable impact on things like aggregate stability or penetrometer resistance and resistance to slaking, that sort of thing.
Yeah, okay.
Depends on the soil type as well.
Yes, yeah, for sure. Okay. Right, let's move on. Next question is, do you need higher nitrogen rates when trying to sequester carbon in no-till? Angus, what do you think?
No.
No.
In a simple answer, no, you don't need. A lot of people have found that in the first 2 or 3 years of no-till, that they do need to increase nitrogen rates slightly, and that is just as the soil is adjusting from a high disturbance regime to a low or a nil disturbance regime. One particular point where increased nitrogen is beneficial is when you're drilling into a high residue situation, i.e. getting a crop established into a heavy chopped straw situation, because that nitrogen is being, all available nitrogen is being used up by the soil microbes trying to break down that 4 or 5 ton a hectare of straw. So you can get into a situation where you can lose a crop, particularly oilseed rape, at establishment because it's starved of nitrogen. So a little bit of nitrogen. I'm only talking 20 kilos in a hectare, which is basically the equivalent to the amount of nitrogen released by mineralization from cultivation. but it's only for the first couple of years.
And just leading on to that, what would be your step then? I mean, it's chicken and egg really. Which comes first, the no-till part or the getting your soil in order part? Where do you see that?
Personally, the strip till establishment that I did with a Missouri drill for 2 years, I think that bridged that gap, and it allowed the soils to slowly acclimatise to a no disturbance regime, and it just gave chance for that balance to be maintained whilst the soils were transitioning.
Great stuff. Okay. What else have we got here? What would be one of your what would be the top tip from the farmers on the call for those who haven't done much about soil carbon yet? Where's the best place to start? Will, do you want to come in on that? What's the best place to start for a farmer coming into this carbon world?
I think Angus is ahead of me. Basically, I've just been looking at cycling carbon and output, and as a result of cycling more carbon, our levels of carbon in the soil have gone up over a period of time, and farming organically. So if you want, you could measure our carbon as a percentage of output if you liked, and certainly in terms of the crops that we're growing, the fodder beet and the oats and the whole crops, we're actually producing a lot of fodder on farm now organically, but in terms of actually measuring it, defining it, I think there are the toolkits out there now that are getting better at it, whether they're quite there, but the reality is we've all got to start working with it. And I think going forward, there will be some money maybe coming out of the private sector that we could actually, because they're going to be looking to offset their carbon. So we've got to get on with it. It's just making sure that we have, a true picture and a true a true representative picture of what the farm looks like with the hedges and all the trees and everything else. I think that's the important bit going forward.
Yeah, great stuff. Okay, we're just 2 minutes past the hour. We've got a couple more questions to go, and then we'll wrap things up. Again, question for Will. Has he thought of mob grazing? Or has he thought of mob grazing, or has he thought that improving soil carbon? So. Mob grazing, what's your comments on mob grazing?
So we actually mob graze our dry cows. So from July through to September, we're actually mob grazing. Some people would call it standing hay, but we actually rotate that around paddocks and on parts of the farm. So there's always a phase of building a lot of organic matter, a lot of carbon in the soil at that time. So we're not necessarily mob, but one of the farms over at Peterborough, we're actually looking at using C4 grasses and the likes of sunflowers and things like that, and peas and beans to actually mob graze a big mix of C4 grasses to see if we can get through these drought periods that we tend to have over there. Yeah.
Okay. His question back to Angus again. Have your yields shifted as reduced traditional N inputs? Has there been any reduction in yield?
No, we haven't had any reduction in yield since we started our journey into regenerative agriculture at all. We're still yielding very well, really, for our soil types.
Yeah, great stuff.
Just with that, Angus, have your inputs gone down as well? So in terms of your ag chem bills and things like that?
Significantly. One of the biggest reductions, well, it's reductions across the board. We don't use any seed dressings, haven't done for several years. Likewise, insecticides. herbicides are slashed because we're not disturbing the soil, so therefore the weeds don't germinate, so with very little herbicide use. Fungicides, synthetic fungicides, we use one synthetic fungicide on the winter wheat because we had yellow rust coming in quite rapidly last season, and one on the winter barley. The spring oats, spring beans, the rest of the wheat and barley fungicide applications are all done with microbiology. So it's, you know, we're slashing all our variable inputs.
Great, thanks, Angus. We'll finish up on one final question, I think, for all of you. Is carbon sequestration the primary objective or the secondary co-benefit to enhancing soil health? Which comes first? Will, let's carbon.
I would say it's a secondary benefit. As farmers, we want to be cycling as much as possible, and the only way we can cycle, you know, maximize the cycling of carbon is by keeping it green and capturing as much energy as possible. So for me, it's just keep it green for as long as possible. You know, and through these winter months, there are crops there that are still, you know, if you look at the trees, and everybody goes on about trees, but they haven't got any leaves on through the winter. You know, a grass layer is still green, and there are other crops out there that are still green, capturing carbon, you know, well, not quite 24/7, but that's what we need to be doing.
Yeah, great stuff. Angus, any comments on that?
Pretty much the two go hand in hand, really. My primary aim is to improve soil health through the measures I take to improve soil health. I'm increasing the carbon and organic matter levels, which is then again improving soil health themselves. So the two very much do go hand in hand, but yeah, soil health is the primary objective.
And David, what's your
yes, I fully agree with that. I think in the past, many of us, including soil scientists like me, have probably, for a few decades, have probably oversold the carbon sequestration aspect. I think we got 20, 30 years ago, we got very excited about what was possible. And I think we got a bit overexcited. So I would say that increasing organic carbon in soil, the primary benefit really is the soil functioning for all of the reasons we've talked about, and the mitigation of climate change is incredibly important as that is the secondary thing there. The one thing where you can, if you like, genuinely, where you can target carbon sequestration very specifically will be if you've got some areas of land that are poor, that are not good for crop growth and so on, taking areas of land actually out of production and going into farm woodlands and so on. This really will increase soil carbon, and of course, as all the wildlife habitat benefits as well. So I see the sequestration as a secondary thing. I mean, globally, it seems to me it's incredibly important that we stop doing the opposite of sequestration, which means expanding agriculture into areas that are wetlands or Cerrado in South America or forests or whatever.
Yeah, great stuff. Thank you, David. Right, well, I think that will do. We've got quite a few questions we can still ask, and we'll get them answered. We'll reply to you individually as we go. Leaves me just to round up the week as it goes. You can see here that the webinars that have passed. The one that we've got here on the 4th, you can see today, and then we've got one tomorrow, supply chain requirements and building a narrative. All of these webinars have been recorded, so you can check back at them at your leisure on our YouTube channel. It's been great to have you along, Will, Angus, David. Thank you for your input. It's invaluable, really, to get first-hand input from the farming sector as well. Resources-wise, we've got the Great Soils publications. If you Google HDB Great Soils, you'll be taken straight to the front page there, where there's a lot of resources available. You can still get hard copy editions of Soil Management Guide, measuring worm counts, compost, measuring soil health, and things like irrigation and water supply as well. It's quite a wealth of resource there as well. Next slide. Is there a next slide, Emily? And that's it. Right. Thank you very much. It leaves me to thank Will, Angus, and David again. Thank you all for attending. Thanks to Emily Collins at HDB Dairy for running the slides in the background, and Amanda Bennett for from Great Soils to handing me the questions. So without further ado, thank you all for attending. You'll be taken to a quick survey for us to understand if this sort of thing is hitting the spot for you. Please undertake it. It really helps us understand where we need to be. And we'll say good afternoon. Goodbye.